Robeland, and I'm Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. I'm here to convey Dean Onwuachi-Willig's welcome. The annual Pike Lecture honors Neil Pike, a graduate of BU from the class of 1937. Mr. Pike was a distinguished lawyer who practiced for 45 years, and he was also an avid supporter of BU law and a tireless advocate for individuals with disabilities. As a child, Mr. Pike suffered a devastating illness resulting in blindness. He was educated at a Perkins School for the Blind, where he earned straight A's before entering BU law in 1934. Upon graduation, he took the bar exam and placed in the top 20 out of 600 candidates. Ultimately, Mr. Pike also became the first blind person to be admitted to the bar of the United States Supreme Court. Today, we welcome you in honor of his memory. Our speaker today is Professor Mary Crossley. Professor Crossley is the John E. Murray Faculty Scholar and Director of the Health Law Program at Pitt Law. She's widely recognized for her scholarship in disability and health law. Professor Crossley has written broadly on issues of inequality in healthcare financing and delivery, and has published articles in numerous law journals, including Columbia Law Review, Notre Dame Law Review, the Yale Journal of Health Policy, Law and Ethics, and the Michigan Journal of Race and Law. She's also the author of the 2022 book, Embodied Injustice, Race, Disability, and Health. Crossley's scholarly interests are reflected in a seminar that she has developed on health justice. And she has also taught courses in health law and policy, in bioethics and the law, in healthcare compliance, family law, and torts. She's an elected member of the American Law Institute and an appointed member of the Pennsylvania State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. She also serves as a member of the board for the Access Lex Institute and for the American Occupational Therapy Association. Crossley was appointed Dean and Professor of Law at the University of Pittsburgh in 2005, and she served as Dean from 2005 to 2012, focusing her leadership on initiatives relating to curricular reform, innovation programming, and promoting diversity. In 2013, she was selected as the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Public Health Law Scholar in Residence. And then in 2014-2015, she served as a faculty mentor for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Future of Public Health Law Education Faculty Fellowship Program. Immediately prior to moving to Pitt Law in 2005, Crossley was the Florida Bar Health Law Section Professor of Law at Florida State University, and before then, she was on the faculty at the University of California Law, San Francisco, formerly Hastings, where she served 2 years as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. Before beginning to teach, Crossley practiced corporate and healthcare law in San Francisco and in New Haven, and clerked for Judge Harry Welford on the Sixth Circuit. Without further ado, I wish to welcome Professor Crossley. We also have the Pike Cup to offer, which is offered every year to our Pike lecture speaker.
Thank you so much.
We are delighted to have you. After the Professor Crossley's remarks are over, there will be time for a Q&A.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay. I'm going to put this up here because it's where
I will least likely knock it over. It is a real pleasure to be here today, and I have long been a fan of the health law program here at BU and an admirer of your health law faculty. So it's a real treat to be here, and it's a particular honor to be giving a lecture named for Neil Pike. What a world he lived in and how much he accomplished, given the barriers he must have encountered. I think we really have a hard time realizing today, with all of the progress in the area of disability rights, what that must have been like. So it truly is an honor. The title of my talk today is Race, Disability, Intersectionality as a Health Equity Imperative. And I realize that's kind of a mouthful. So probably my chief goal today is to try to make sense of that title for you. And in doing so, I'm going to be relying heavily on the book that I published this last summer, Embodied Injustice, Race, Disability, and Health. I submitted the book proposal for this book in the summer of 2019. And when I did that, the proposal did not end up including a chapter that eventually would become a very important part of my book, and that was a chapter about COVID-19. I started writing the book in January 2020 as COVID-19 was first reaching the US. Because I was on sabbatical, I spent every day immersed in researching and writing. And as I researched and wrote, COVID-19 erupted around the globe and reinforced in the most terrible way the relevance of my project. So many stories from the pandemic illustrated the concerns I was writing about. Some of those stories are difficult to hear. I'll start by telling you just one of them. And that's the story of Michael Hickson, who died on June 11, 2020, from complications of COVID-19. Michael Hickson was a 46-year-old black man, the father of 5. He had had a career as an auto insurance claims estimator until it was cut short when he experienced a sudden cardiac arrest at the age of just 43 years. Complications left him with quadriplegia, blindness, and brain injuries. Although he had difficulty speaking and remembering things, Michael Hickson continued to participate in his family's life, joking with his children and talking with his wife about their lives. He contracted COVID in a nursing home and was transferred to a hospital in Austin, Texas. As many people hospitalized with COVID-19, the course of Michael Hickson's illness was difficult. He developed pneumonia, a urinary tract infection, and sepsis. After he'd been in the hospital for just 3 days, his medical team communicated to his family that, in the physician's opinion, continuing to treat him would be futile. They conveyed that further treatment offered no chance of improvement and recommended that he should begin receiving hospice care. His sister, who was a physician living in Washington, D.C., agreed with the medical team's proposed shift in approach. But Melissa Hickson, Michael's wife of 18 years, rejected the suggestion that it was time to throw in the towel on her husband's life. She agreed that he should not be intubated, but believed that he had a chance to live if less invasive treatment for COVID was continued. In a conversation recorded by Mrs. Hickson, she asks her husband's doctor why continuing to treat his COVID-19 would be futile. The doctor responded, quote, "'Cause as of right now, his quality of life, he doesn't have much of one." Mrs. Hickson asked, "What do you mean? Because he's paralyzed with a brain injury, he doesn't have quality of life?" The doctor replied, "Correct." Over his wife's objections, the hospital withdrew treatment from Michael Hickson and put him in hospice care. After 6 days without any treatment for COVID-19, he died. Multiple news outlets told the story of the hospital's withdrawal of treatment from Michael Hickson and his demise, but those accounts did not, and probably could not, offer a fully fleshed out description of the fullness of Michael Hickson's life, of his relationships with his wife, his children, his friends. The accounts also did not and could not answer the questions that Michael Hickson's story left me wondering about. Would Michael Hickson have survived COVID-19 and gone home to his family if the hospital had treated his illness aggressively rather than withdrawing treatment? Or would he have died, even with continued treatment? Would the hospital have insisted on withdrawing treatment if Michael Hickson had not had cognitive and physical disabilities? Would it have insisted on withdrawing treatment over his wife's objections if Michael Hickson had been a white man? So back to my writing a book. It may not be obvious why a woman who identifies as white and non-disabled would write a book about race, disability, and health injustice. I cannot speak with the authority of lived experience on these matters, but I try to be a student of those who can, as well as of the scholars who have done important work in these areas. The idea of looking broadly at race-based and disability-based health inequities and their connections had been something I'd been thinking about for many years. I became a law professor the year after the ADA was enacted, and most of my earliest research explored how disability discrimination law might apply in various healthcare and health policy settings. While I was doing that work, I increasingly learned how disability inequities are just one strand of a much larger fabric of disparities and inequities experienced by Black and brown communities and other groups that our society has marginalized. And as I studied health-related injustices experienced by Black people in particular, I discerned what seemed to be parallels or similarities to the health-related inequities experienced by disabled people. A core similarity was that at the root of both were deeply ingrained and erroneous assumptions about bodily difference and inferiority. And that's what my title, Embodied Injustice, tries to convey. That health-related injustices endured by Black and disabled people flow in part from unfounded beliefs that there is something about the bodies and minds of disabled people and Black people that is intrinsically different and somehow inferior as compared to white, abled bodies that the medical profession, the healthcare system, and society more broadly have established as norms. As I studied more, I realized that it's also critically important to consider how the experiences and identities of being Black and being disabled intersect in the lives of people who are both Black and disabled. So what I'll do in this talk today is first talk a little bit about one parallel between experiences of Black people and disabled people that I examine in the book. And I'll touch on the meanings of racism and ableism before going on to talk about the importance of considering Blackness and disability intersectionally. Then I'll close by suggesting one example of an area where racial justice and disability justice advocates might work collaboratively to advance health equity for Black people, and disabled Black people. A widely shared mistrust of the medical profession and healthcare system is the parallel that I'm going to talk about. This is a big topic, but I can give you some highlights this afternoon. The starting point is that trust matters to medical outcomes. Distrust of the medical profession can affect a person's decision concerning whether to seek medical care, how openly to share health concerns, and how closely to follow a provider's advice. The recognition that low levels of trust can thus contribute to poor outcomes has led to various initiatives over the years to increase the trust that Black people or those people from other marginalized communities have in medicine. These initiatives approached low levels of trust almost as if it was a vitamin deficiency that needed to be corrected. Recently, though, the conversation around medical distrust has begun to shift. Conversations today are more likely to identify the problem as a dearth of trustworthiness on the part of the medical and scientific communities, and to consider what remedial steps might make those communities demonstrably more trustworthy. The sources of medical distrust among Black people and disabled people are complex, and they have many dimensions. Today, I'm going to highlight a shared history of being subjected to non-consensual medical experimentation and current-day experiences of disregard and devaluation within healthcare. Medical apartheid is the title Harriet Washington gave to her sweeping history of medical experimentation on Black people in America. The book reveals a long-standing and pervasive willingness among scientists, doctors, and the government to exploit Black bodies as to further white goals that included a tangled mix of medical knowledge, power, and profit. Washington describes the well-known Tuskegee study, which ran from 1932 to 1972 and which was sponsored by the U.S. Public Health Service, among other institutions. The decades-long study examined untreated syphilis in Black men, withholding penicillin from men, some of whom are pictured here, even when that effective treatment became available. But Washington argues that the Tuskegee study should be understood as emblematic, not an isolated experience. The historical record also includes surgical experiments by J. Merriam Sims, whom some call the father of modern gynecology. He performed surgical experiments on numerous enslaved women in the 1850s, and this is a statue of Sims that long stood in Central Park. The goal of the surgeries was to figure out how to repair vesicovaginal fistulas. These were injuries from childbirth that caused uncontrollable incontinence. Sims developed his surgical technique through trial and error, operating more than 30 times on one woman named Anarcha alone. Ether was not yet in common usage, so the women received no anesthesia during these repeated surgical experiments. Recent debates about the ethics of Sims' surgery have a Rorschach test quality to them. Apologists portray Sims as a product of his time and laud how knowledge that he developed ultimately helped women with this condition. Critics denounce Sims for personally profiting from pain he caused to enslaved women who were entirely powerless to withhold their consent or seek medical treatment for the condition. And this is a picture of protesters at the statue of Sims. Protest eventually led to the removal of his statue from Central Park. However portrayed, Sims's career exemplified a broader pattern of white men, and doctors in particular, assuming control over Black women's bodies for their own purposes. So I'll close this story by sharing a photo I really like, which is a monument to the enslaved women on whom Sims experimented. This monument was erected in Montgomery, Alabama in 2021 and is titled The Mothers of Gynecology. Black people have also long undergone more mundane devaluation and discrimination in medical settings. Decades after civil rights laws ended legal segregation in healthcare facilities, many Black Americans still receive healthcare in facilities that continue to be de facto segregated. Black people today regularly experience that they are treated differently from white people by healthcare professionals. In a 2020 survey, 7 in 10 Black Americans said that the healthcare system treats patients unfairly based on their race or ethnicity, either very or somewhat often. And 1 in 5 Black adults reported experiencing racial discrimination when getting healthcare for themselves or their family just in the past year. In short, contemporary experience layers onto histories of exploitation and devaluation to give Black Americans good reason to be suspicious of doctors and the healthcare system. Research documenting better health outcomes when Black patients are treated by Black doctors gives credence to these suspicions. A stunning example can be seen in a 2020 study finding that the mortality rate for Black babies was cut in half when Black doctors cared for those infants, an effect that showed up even more strongly in complicated cases. Like Black people, people with disabilities have a history of being subjected involuntarily to medical research. In many cases, that research occurred in state-run institutions where disabled people had no power to refuse to participate and where degradation and mistreatment of residents were endemic. The 1972 expose of horrific conditions at Willowbrook State School for children with intellectual disabilities is probably the best known example. Beyond its squalor, though, Willowbrook was the site of experiments that Dr. Saul Krugman performed on disabled children. In the name of searching for a cure or vaccine for hepatitis, Krugman extracted hepatitis virus from the feces of 6 infected Willowbrook residents and used it to infect other children living at Willowbrook by putting the virus in their food. Krugman, like Sims, has his defenders. Some scholars defended Krugman because he obtained consent from the parents of the children involved and independent review from other experts. And his research, in fact, contributed to the development of the hepatitis B vaccine. Other ethicists, however, argue that no amount of knowledge gained can justify intentionally infecting disabled children with a potentially deadly virus. One critic wrote to the medical journal, The Lancet, "If Krugman and colleagues are keen to continue their experiments, I suggest that they invite the parents of the children involved to participate. I wonder what the response would be." Like Black people, disabled people experience discrimination and disregard in more mundane medical settings. Seeking medical care routinely entails barriers and indignities for people with disabilities. Decades after the ADA's passage, the medical equipment in many providers' offices remains inaccessible. Research published in 2018 reported that among 250 specialist physicians who were asked to accept the referral of a hypothetical patient who had partial paralysis and used a wheelchair, fewer than 10% had appropriate equipment or employees trained to help examine patients with disabilities. This lack of accessible equipment and appropriate training keeps patients who use a wheelchair from being weighed, being properly examined, or receiving screening tests like pap smears or mammograms. Moreover, disabled people may find that they aren't treated respectfully as autonomous agents. Disabled people describe how physicians regularly undervalue medical interventions that support their daily functioning but do not fix their disability. Disabled people also describe how doctors still express views of disability as a flaw needing medical correction. Research going back decades documents that many physicians tend to believe that disability causes diminished enjoyment of or satisfaction with life, when in fact surveys of people with varying disabilities show that they are about as satisfied with their lives as people who don't have disabilities. Confirming the persistence of these erroneous assumptions, 82% of physicians who responded to a recent national survey indicated that they believe that people with significant disability generally have a worse quality of life than non-disabled people. Bill Peace's story offers a chilling illustration of how physicians may fail to appreciate the value of continued life to a disabled person. An anthropologist and disability rights advocate who used a wheelchair, Peace wrote about an encounter he had when hospitalized with a life-threatening wound infection. Peace was medically stable, but had a high fever and was vomiting when a physician whom he'd never met before visited him at 2 a.m. in his hospital room. Alone with Peace, the physician detailed the medical, social, and financial challenges of continuing to treat Peace's wound. Then the physician told Peace he could discontinue the antibiotic treatment needed to save Peace's life and assured him that if Peace chose that option, he could be made very comfortable. Peace rejected the suggestion. Later, after recovering from his wound, he described that night. writing, "My fear was based on the knowledge that my existence as a person with a disability was not valued. Many people, the physician I met that fateful night included, assume disability is a fate worse than death. In a visceral and potentially lethal way, that night made me realize I was not a human being, but rather a tragic figure. Out of the kindness of the physician's heart, I was being given a chance to end my life." Peace insisted that his suspicion and fear were not unique. Again writing, "Most people with a disability fear even the most routine hospitalization. We do not fear any of the commonplace indignities that those without a disability worry about when hospitalized. Our fear is primal. Will our lives be considered devoid of value?" So we can see the historical, empirical, and experiential evidence of medicine's exploitation and devaluation of Black people and people with disabilities in the United States. The stories I've portrayed are not identical, to be sure. They have a similar effect, though, of indicating that Black people's and disabled people's shared wariness of medical practitioners and researchers is a sensible response to unspoken and explicit messages conveyed over decades and centuries. The stories that I've been telling so far largely involve interpersonal interactions where health professionals have biased views of Black people or disabled people, either consciously or unconsciously. Biased actions at the interpersonal level can produce very real health harms. But the health-related harms caused by structural racism or ableism are even greater. So let me tell you what I mean when I talk about racism or ableism. In basic terms, we could define racism as the assignment of people of color to inferior status and treatment based on unfounded beliefs about their innate inferiority, along with unjust treatment of people of color, whether it's intended or not. Ableism is a term that is less widely recognized, but we can really define it by substituting disabled people for people of color. So the definition of ableism would be that it is the assignment of disabled people to inferior status and treatment based on unfounded beliefs about their innate inferiority, along with intentional or unintentional unjust treatment of them. And I realize that for some folks, bringing up racism can be a conversation stopper or provoke feelings of defensiveness, and I think that that is in part because of a mismatch in understandings of what the term encompasses. Certainly one form of racism is the hateful or malicious or overtly biased attitudes some people exhibit towards Black people or other people of color. But it can also include unconscious race-based biases that people may not even be conscious that they have. These implicit biases, which we can think of as being akin to ingrained assumptions or stereotypes, develop when a person is exposed repeatedly to images and descriptions in media or social interactions. Both overt racial malice and implicit bias are forms of what we could refer to as interpersonal racism. The other category of racism that is actually more important than interpersonal racism in causing health disparities, though, is what is often called structural racism, systemic racism, or institutional racism. And these terms have distinct meanings for folks who study this area closely, but for our purposes, I'm going to group them together under the label of structural racism. And the key idea here is that society's laws, policies, economics, and institutions can be structured in a way that disadvantages people of color. It's not simply people behaving badly or acting based on implicit biases. It's that the way that systems are set up can hold groups of people back, even if those systems appear to treat people the same regardless of race. Explicit and implicit biases connect to structural racism, though, because persons who hold these biases may be less likely to object to or even recognize examples of structural racism. Researchers have used the metaphor of the racism iceberg to suggest how only a small portion of racism existing in our society is visible above the surface of the water, so to speak. The portion above the water is visible the portion above the waterline would be overtly biased or hateful conduct. Most racism in the US today, by contrast, is more difficult to perceive because it's embedded in structures and policies, or to use the metaphor, it lies below the water's surface. Another metaphor may also be helpful. One of my favorite phrases from a US Supreme Court opinion is the phrase, built-in headwinds. Chief Justice Berger used the phrase way back in 1971 to describe how some practices used by employers to decide whom to hire could have the effect of disadvantaging Black applicants, even if the practice made no reference to race. This case was the first to hold that practices that on their faces are neutral with respect to race, but that have a disproportionately negative impact on Black people, could violate employment discrimination laws. In describing such practices as creating built-in headwinds, Chief Justice Berger was using the phrase metaphorically, of course. But its literal meaning came back to my mind over winter break when I was fortunate enough to get away to South Carolina for a week to escape Pittsburgh winter weather. While I was down there, we rented bikes and decided to ride them on the beach one day. And when we started riding, I felt like I could ride all day. But when we turned around, I immediately struggled just to move along slowly. There was a brisk wind that day, a wind that I wasn't even conscious of when it was at my back. But once I started riding into it, once I faced a headwind, it slowed my progress in a way that was obvious to me. Structural racism can be thought of as creating the various kinds of powerful built-in headwinds that people of color face in society. People who are trying to make progress against the headwinds of structural racism feel them keenly, but people who don't face them, white people like me, may not perceive them at all. Similarly, structural ableism can be thought of as the various kinds of built-in headwinds that disabled people face in society. So, moving away from metaphors, what are some concrete examples? One historical example of structural racism was Southern states' use, prior to the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, of literacy tests to prevent Black people from voting. A current-day example of structural ableism in healthcare is the prevalence of medical office equipment that's not accessible to people with disabilities. A contemporary example of structural racism in healthcare settings is the fact that Medicaid, the public health insurance program for low-income Americans, pays doctors notoriously low rates for treating Medicaid enrollees, discouraging many doctors from accepting Medicaid patients. Because Black people, who earn less than white people in the US, are disproportionately enrolled in Medicaid, the program's low payment rates helps create disparities in Black people's ability to access medical care. And instances of structural racism outside of the healthcare sector can disadvantage people of color with respect to social determinants of health, like housing, transportation, education, employment, the criminal legal system, all of which have been shown to have significant impacts on people's health. This idea that structures can be unjust and discriminatory is important to another key point that I make in my book, which involves the intersection of Blackness and disability. Basically, the idea of intersectionality is that to fully appreciate a person's experience and for the law to ensure that people are not unjustly disadvantaged, it's essential to consider the combined effect of multiple aspects of a person's identity. When legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw developed the concept back in the late 1980s, she was focused on how Black women's experiences of workplace discrimination were different from the experiences of either Black men or white women, and how that prevented Black women from winning employment discrimination lawsuits. Since then, intersectional analyses have expanded beyond race and gender to encompass other dimensions of human identity, like sexual orientation or class. But the intersection of Blackness and disability has received remarkably little attention, either empirically by health researchers or in discussions of and advocacy around health justice. We do know, though, that in the US, disability is typically more prevalent among Black people than among whites. As this graphic from the CDC shows, approximately 1 in 4 Black people in the US have a disability, compared to 1 in 5 among white people. Why haven't researchers and activists paid more attention to this intersection? In my book, I suggest that both the disability rights movement and racial justice advocates have had reasons for kind of looking the other way, in a sense, when it comes to the disproportionate disablement of Black Americans. Racial justice advocates are contending with a long history in which dominant white society has associated Blackness with biological inferiority, incapacity, and disability. Black people's supposed inferiority supplied white people with arguments for enslaving, disenfranchising, and subordinating Black people. In short, white people weaponized disability historically against Black people. For that reason, many Black people have attached a special stigma to disability and felt a need to distance themselves from any identification with disability. In addition, Black disabled people have often felt alienated from the so-called mainstream disability rights movement and marginalized within the academic field of disability studies. Part of the critique of disability studies is that it has paid little heed to the intersectional lives of disabled Black people and how the acquisition of legal rights against discrimination, like those enacted in the Americans with Disabilities Act, would do little to address the full range of subordination that many Black people live with, a point I'll address further in a minute. So many Black folks have reasons that they don't feel kinship with the mainstream disability rights movement. But what about disability rights advocates? Why haven't they paid more attention to Black people with disabilities? To start, for most of its history, the leadership of the disability rights movement has been held predominantly by white people, leading the social worker and disability justice activist Melissa Thompson to create the hashtag #DisabilityToWhite in 2016. And some would suggest that those leaders paid little heed to the experiences and challenges that Black people faced because the leaders were oblivious to the privilege that attached to their racial identity, even as they experienced disadvantage as a result of their disability. But I also surmise that paying careful attention to the injustice associated with the disproportionate disablement among Black people would have required disability rights leaders to face some uncomfortable truths about the limits of the disability rights movement. So what do I mean by that? Although the research remains quite limited, it appears highly likely that disability's more frequent and earlier appearance among Black people is attributable to unjust social, economic, and political conditions that are the product of the kind of structural racism I was just talking about, the built-in headwinds. Scholars coined the term emergent disability to describe how disabling conditions multiply in communities experiencing poverty or disadvantage. Much disability among Black people likely fits in this category of emergent disability. Examples are not hard to identify. The children in Flint, Michigan, who acquired learning disabilities after being exposed to lead in their drinking water. The Black Americans with diabetes who disproportionately lose limbs to amputation, often because they faced barriers to accessing medical care to diagnose and manage the condition. The victims of gun violence living in communities of concentrated poverty, where systematic disinvestment has largely eliminated opportunity and left illegal activity to fill the void. Less vivid examples exist as well. One study found that Black women in the US over the age of 50 had a prevalence of physical disability equivalent to white women who were 10 years older. The point that I'm trying to make is that for many Black disabled people, more so than for white disabled people, disability has its origin in inequitable social and economic circumstances. And that means that folks who are Black and disabled may face layers of injustice and exclusion. Because of their disability, they may face barriers to full participation in society. But in many cases, having that disability may be chalked up to racial injustices that persist in the US. In those cases, the wins of the disability rights movement aren't enough. Think again about the mother of the child in Flint who has been intellectually disabled by lead poisoning. Good special education services are vitally important, but they are not enough to feel that justice has been satisfied. Or the middle-aged man who lost a foot to amputation because he had trouble getting to see a doctor and his diabetes was not managed properly. Having an accessible examination table will be important the next time he gets in to see the doctor, but it's not enough. When a person's impairment results from unjust social structures, the accommodations and policy adaptations historically sought by the disability rights movement, while valuable, are not adequate to redress the injustice experienced. The disproportionate disablement of Black Americans and its unjust sources may also create some cognitive dissonance with the disability right movement's cultivation of and endorsement of disability pride. Invocations of and parades celebrating disability pride encourage people with varying disability to value their common identity as disabled people. But for a person whose impairment is the product of unjust social structures, pride may not feel like a suitable response. All of this is to say is that there are explanations for the historically arm's-length relationship between the movements for racial justice and disability rights. This has begun changing in recent years, but there's still a long way to go. But I'd argue that very good reasons exist to support more intersectional partnerships between advocates for racial justice and advocates for disability justice. At its core, the choice to emphasize intersectionality is a moral commitment. Justice-promoting initiatives that fail to consider intersectional lives risk leaving behind persons who face multiple sources of disadvantage, those who are most often marginalized. Sometimes those persons may be marginalized even within a social movement by relatively privileged leaders who are relatively privileged leaders who are keenly aware of the disadvantage experienced based on one aspect of personal identity, but don't recognize their relative privilege on a different axis. So to make that more concrete, a racial justice activist highly attuned to their own disadvantage in a racial hierarchy may not consider the privilege attached to their lack of disability. Or a disability rights advocate, while highly aware of the stigma and barriers that disabled people face, may be oblivious to their privilege as a white person. Centering the multiple aspects of each person's identity may help mitigate this intra-movement marginalization. Kimberly Crenshaw encourages us to view organized identity groups as potential coalitions waiting to be formed. When we are thinking about Blackness and disability, this approach calls for Black people to be understood as a coalition of disabled and non-disabled Black people, and for disabled people as a group to be understood as a coalition of white people who are disabled and Black people who are disabled, along with other disabled people of color. This reconceptualization moves Black disabled people away from the periphery of both anti-racism movements and disability rights movements and resituates them centrally at the point of overlap between two groups. Centering intersectional lives in this fashion opens an opportunity for transformational coalition building in social movements by simultaneously disrupting conceptions of privilege within social movements and helping those movements transcend a competitive zero-sum game approach to politics. Centering intersectional lives prompts recognition of movements' shared objectives and beliefs. It can enlarge the number of people who feel included in a movement and engender more expansive understandings of what justice requires. The call for a movement that advances disability justice as inseparable from racial justice gained considerable traction as the COVID-19 pandemic laid bare how structural inequities disproportionately sickened and killed people who were Black or disabled or both. A few years ago, BU's very own Ibram X. Kendi, the noted anti-racist scholar, invited noted disability justice leader Rebecca Coakley to be on his Be Anti-Racist podcast. After a rich discussion of the shared roots and common manifestations of racism and ableism in the United States, Kendi concluded by saying, "It's pretty apparent to me that one cannot be anti-racist while still being ableist, and you can't be anti-ableist unless you're also striving to be anti-racist." To which Coakley replied, "It is such an opportunity for greater solidarity, greater learning, greater co-conspiratorship." So ultimately, my hope is that my book might help foster greater solidarity between advocates for racial justice and advocates for disability justice. By shining a light on the similarities in health inequities endured by disabled people and Black people, and underscoring the unjustly high prevalence of disability among Black people, I aim to contribute metaphorical stones for constructing a foundation for increased cross-alliance collective action. In other words, more and stronger partnerships between Black people and disabled people engaging in advocacy and activism for health justice. In the book, I suggest several specific health-related policy targets for collective action where those groups' interests seem potentially aligned. I call one of these targets transforming medical mindsets. Right? The book describes how many instances where physicians' mindsets, their beliefs, biases, and predilections have resulted in actions harming Black patients and disabled patients. To be sure, achieving health justice will require reforms beyond the doctor-patient encounter. But that encounter does matter. Together, racial and disability justice advocates could demand an answer to the question, how can doctors learn to value and understand bodies and minds that vary from norms of ableness and whiteness, and to respect the patients who live in those bodies? One concrete target of advocacy along these lines would be medical school accreditation standards and the liaison committee on medical education that is responsible for those standards. Over the past decade, the LCME has added language to its accreditation standards regarding the need for diversity in the medical profession and the need for medical students to develop cultural competency and to learn about health disparities. But its existing standards are too weak and watered down to meaningfully help transform medical mindsets. They utterly fail to require that students learn about structural factors like racism and ableism, or social determinants of health that contribute to health disparities. Racial justice and disability justice advocates could join forces to lobby the LCME to strengthen its standards to incorporate explicitly anti-racist and anti-ableist perspectives. This would not be an entirely new demand. The murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police and the shocking racial disparities in the COVID-19 pandemic added fuel to calls for anti-racist medical education. Advocacy for incorporating disability-conscious and anti-ableist perspectives in medical education, while less prominent, have also been ongoing. My point is that an intersectional alliance of racial justice and disability justice advocates could push for accreditation standards that incorporate explicitly anti-racist and anti-ableist standards, so that budding doctors would be equipped to provide high-quality care to all their patients. But I want to close this talk by suggesting the broader value of paying attention to health justice. While the book focuses on health justice for people who are Black, disabled, or both, the policy objectives that I suggest offer potential benefits for advancing health justice more broadly. Racial justice and disability justice activists are rightly motivated to improve the health prospects and lives of the people they care about most. Pursuing policies to ensure that all members of our society can enjoy good health and long lives will require interventions targeting groups that currently fall the furthest short of those ideals. But most health equity promoting interventions, even if they're targeted to address injustice experienced by a particular group, are readily adaptable to provide broader progress toward equitable health outcomes. One thing we've learned from the successes of the disability rights movement is that many modifications called for by the ADA don't benefit only disabled people. The so-called curb cut effect points out how programs or laws designed specifically to help a vulnerable group ultimately benefit society more broadly. I expect that many policies or initiatives to increase health equity for Black and disabled people would have the effect of benefiting the health of many other people as well. From a purely financial perspective, it's critical to realize that health disparities cost our society huge sums because of lost productivity and the additional costs of treating medical problems too late. An analysis published in 2018 estimated that eliminating racial health disparities in the US would result in a $135 billion increase in gross domestic product per year. Fundamentally, promoting health justice for Black people, disabled people, and others who experience health disparities does not necessarily entail harming persons in groups that have already been living longer and healthier lives. Health is not a zero-sum game. This is a point that Heather McGhee makes in her best-selling book, The Sum of Us. To be sure, remedying structural inequities and other factors contributing to health disparities will not be costless. It may well require addressing the large and growing inequalities in income and wealth in the United States. Studies find an association across societies between increased income and wealth inequality and overall worse health outcomes. The flip side of the coin is that more egalitarian societies tend to be healthier overall. We know from the COVID-19 pandemic that poorer, darker-skinned, and disabled people sickened and died at higher rates in the US. But we also know that wealthy, white, able people have not been spared. In fact, our cumulative deaths per capita from COVID-19 in the US have been among the highest among large, high-income countries. To me, the message is clear. Our well-being is connected. We should learn from the pandemic that, as noted health justice scholar Dana Bowen Matthew puts it, structural inequality threatens the health of our entire population, not just the health of the poor. Or, to adapt an often quoted warning from Dr. King, health injustice anywhere is a threat to health everywhere. I'd like to close this afternoon by framing that cautionary point more positively, by saying that health justice is good for everyone. So thank you. Somebody up here.
Well, that was really phenomenal. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your insights and sort of connecting the dots across some really important subjects. One of the things I thought was interesting, how you really gave us a tour across so much of health law and bioethics, bringing in concepts of futility, for example, and consent. But I wanted to ask about the Affordable Care Act included a new anti-discrimination provision, Section 1557, which is kind of a peculiar law for really just pointing at all the other anti-discrimination rules that are in the federal statutes and saying these apply to all federal health care programs. Any thoughts on litigation post-1557 or progress? Has that become a tool to fight this battle? because so far I haven't seen it, and I'd love for your perspective on that tool as addressed to this problem.
So great question, and this is so when I teach Section 1557 in my health law and policy class, the last slide that I show is of the magic 8-ball, and I don't know how many of you remember the magic 8-ball, but the message that it's giving you is the future is hazy, right? And the reason I say that is a couple of reasons. One, the language of 1557, as you suggest, is at the same time both very spare and convoluted by pointing to these pre-existing statutes and saying they apply really broadly. Part of the problem with 1557 so far is that because the language itself is so spare, it becomes very important to see how it is interpreted in HHS regulations. And what we've seen are 2016 regulations by the Obama administration, which finally came out 6 years after the statute's passage. Then in 4 years, those were replaced by 2020 Trump regulations. And just this past summer, the Biden administration has proposed new regulations. Now, there has been some litigation under Section 1557. Some cases have been helpful in terms of moving towards what I think are more just outcomes. Some have been unhelpful. And a lot of the attention around 1557 has focused on issues around what it means to discriminate based on sex, right, as opposed to questions relating to race or disability. I think that if the Biden administration regs go through as proposed or close to as proposed, there will be some additional modest progress that occurs. They take a pretty broad stance on who is subject to 1557 in terms of different types of healthcare providers. They introduce this idea that algorithmic discrimination can be a basis for liability under Section 1557. I can't say that 1557, other than sending out this message that this law applies broadly and creating a new sex-based discrimination prohibition that is truly new, I can't say that it's done a lot so far, right? Whether it has potential to do that in the future, I think depends on the regulations and then what the courts do with those regulations. Exactly. So it's...
Thank you so much. Okay. Is it on? Hello?
It's on now.
Thank you. This was really interesting. I had sort of two maybe related sets of questions. One is the extent to which your talk and your book are focused on anti-Black racism or more generalizable. In places, you were talking specifically about sort of intersectionality with respect to Black people and disabled people with disabilities. And then in other places, you were saying, and other communities of color. And I'm sort of interested in the extent, because in my reading and personal experience, there are other forms of racism in the healthcare system focused on Latino people, the sort of hysterical Hispanic woman in the minds of medical professionals, and I wonder the extent to which your work focuses on that. And then the second kind of related question is, it seems that there are two levels of issues. One of them is the bias within the minds of medical professionals, and the other is the physical infrastructure in the physician's office, right? And the people with disabilities seem to me to be vulnerable to both sets of problems, and people of color, principally the former, right, rather than the physical infrastructure. And I wonder the implications of your study and your approach for those two interrelated but somewhat distinct sets of issues.
Yeah, thank you. So let me do the second question first. And actually, I would argue that, you know, what we might think of as physical infrastructure in physicians' offices actually is also the result of perhaps not consciously held biases, but unconsciously held assumptions about who comes to a doctor's office. Why did we start off with examination tables that are up here, right? It's because we assume that we're not going to have people who need to transfer from a wheelchair. So I think that it is not difficult to really trace back even what we might think of as physical barriers to those sorts of biases, or whether they are explicit or implicit, or assumptions. And I think it's important as well to, you know, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, that today when we think about how racism serves to exclude people from good health, those can also be thought of as barriers, right? So barriers can take physical forms, they can take attitudinal forms, they can take other forms. And so I think that I don't find it as helpful to think of physical barriers as distinctive, right, as contrasted with other types of barriers that might be exclusionary. In terms of your first question, I did focus on Blackness and disability. And that's for a couple of reasons, several reasons. One, and people also, you know, sometimes ask me, well, what about sex? What about other types of identities? I felt a need to focus my study. And given the history of the United States, and given the extent of research that's available, focusing on Blackness was the area where I saw the most significant parallels, which is not to say that if I had looked harder at other types of identities, I wouldn't have found other things to say that would have probably in some ways been distinctive and in some ways would have shown commonalities. But that was the scope of my project. Sure.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting. And my question is a bit builds on what Stacy was asking, so forgive me if it feels repetitive, but maybe there's a slightly different sort of bend to it. So I teach in the Immigrants' Rights Clinic here, and we're co-counsel in a class action lawsuit, the Old Acker litigation in Georgia, a group of more than a dozen women who were survivors of medical abuse by a doctor in an ICE facility there, in a jail that was contracted with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. You might be familiar with the litigation. And so in your talk, I was thinking a lot about our plaintiffs and the history of medical exploitation of women, women of color. And then I guess I'm just sort of adding that extra gloss of immigration status and wondering if you could talk at all, and maybe your answer is the same one you gave to Stacy, which is I really had to focus my research, and that's understandable. But I'm curious, I mean, you know, you've alluded to sort of gender or gender identity and things like that. I'm wondering whether immigration status might be an additional lens through which you look at this, and what that might look like. And I'm thinking in particular just of the sort of, the horrific violence that our clients were subject to, many of whom are Black immigrant women without immigration status.
Yeah. So again, in some ways I am going to echo my earlier answer, which was that it was like, yeah, I could write about this as well. But I need to narrow. The other thing, just to follow up on my point earlier, is that I do think that there's more, and again, maybe it's because I haven't looked far enough in terms of looking at other racial or ethnic identities in terms of the research that's been done, but the history of kind of viewing some bodies as innately distinctive and inferior. The whole idea of kind of race as a biological fact as opposed to a social construct is again what led me to focus on Blackness particularly. I do think that when you talk about immigration status, it's kind of like layering vulnerability upon vulnerability. And so in one of the chapters in the book, one of the areas of similarity I write about is the history of women who are disabled or Black, or it could be Latina, or it could be immigrant, being subjected to constraints on their reproductive capacity, non-consensual sterilizations, or other actions that limit their reproductive capacity. So I do think, you know, there are lots of places to expand out, you know, things that I have written about, and I look forward to either working on that or seeing other people's work in those areas. So good luck with your litigation. I know there's a question, yeah.
Hi, thank you for your framing of embodied injustice, and I'm really thinking about what does it look like for justice to be felt and embodied? And there's some, you know, organizers in Chicago and Oakland working on this theory of essentially politicized healing, right? Like, as you've stated, when it comes to structural inequality for Black and brown, indigenous people and other communities, it's truly an act of resistance to be healthy and to engage in healing. And so I'm wondering, what are the ways from top down and bottom up that academics and lawyers can really engage with this idea of embodied justice and what that would look like, if you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I have instincts about that, and I don't know the answer, but I think it's so important, the point you raise about the bottoms up, right? So groups like Sins Invalid and other types of disability justice organizers that focus on intersectionality and that incorporate art and that are really very positive and justice oriented. I think that perhaps the most I can say is that folks who are doing litigation or who are engaged in policy work really need to make sure to tap into that creativity and that energy, because, you know, someone who is like me, who, as I said, doesn't have the lived experience, I can't be a person, or someone like me can't be the person figuring out what embodied justice is, right? That needs to come from a source that actually has some authority and expertise on that subject. So, you know, I think the more that there can be not only kind of intersectional collaboration in terms of social movements, but also differing kind of players in the health justice ecosystem, to think about activist groups and advocates in judicial or legislative or regulatory fora, and scholars. If there are ways to bring those together, I think that's what is going to be most fruitful. So I'm afraid I just kind of gave you one of those law professor answers where it wasn't anything very specific, but I do think that that's going to be a critical part of forward progress. Thanks.
Thank you for your talk. And I realize everyone else has asked this question, so I accept completely the answer that these are the groups you're studying. Yet, when you put a slide up that showed disability diagnosis that was 3 in 10 for Native population,
Yeah.
1 in 5 white population, 1 in 4 Black, 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 Latino, and then at the other end, 1 in 10 Asian American, that's what stood out to me in that slide. And in terms of a story of disparity, that's incredibly striking on that chart. And so, so I'm wondering, even though that's not what you wrote about, what's the account? Because obviously history of discrimination, you know, past, present, violence, legal structures that are discriminatory. I mean, that's all there. What's that account?
I'll be very honest. I don't have that account. I don't know the explanation for that. I could try to
Yeah, don't do that.
speculate right
But
now.
who's writing that?
Yeah, right. I could
Who's
try to
writing about it?
speculate right now, but I kind of don't want to.
Yeah.
Right? Because I don't want to get it wrong, and I don't want to get it wrong in ways that actually could be harmful. So if anyone else in the room has that account, I would welcome it, but I'm just trying to be real honest here.
Hi.
Hi.
Yes, I really appreciated the talk. And you focused a lot about, as a specific issue, the equipment in doctors' offices. And I was wondering if there's a way to think about anti-ableism that kind of describes what needs to be done in a, like, because I feel like I've heard a lot, like, what we need to be prepared for everything, the range of disabilities, the fact that there's, there's blindness, there's deafness, there's all sorts of physical impairments that will change what the needs are of that equipment. And sometimes equipment that is conducive to one disability isn't conducive to another disability. So is there a way to think about creating welcoming environments or environments that are just in an optimal way, or to start approaching that in the best way?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think, to be fair, if we take a snapshot of today as a point in time, we are the inheritors of systems that over years have created many built structures as well as customary ways of doing things like communicating, using oral communication and the print word that function to exclude people with disabilities. And so, there is a fair and real question about how do we move from this point in time to a point in time where we have structures and approaches that are inclusive that are broadly inclusive. And I think that requires a lot of forethought. I think it requires input from the disability community. I think it requires innovation from an engineering perspective. I also think it requires, on some level, transforming medical mindsets. There has been, for somebody who just kind of tries to read what comes out regarding disability in healthcare, there's been an enormously disheartening series of articles published in Health Affairs over the past year and a half that have resulted from surveys and focus groups with physicians regarding their knowledge of the requirements of the ADA, their attitudes towards people with disabilities. And the most recent one really was about attitudes towards people with disabilities and how a large number, or a significant number of physician participants in these focus groups really didn't particularly want patients with disabilities in their practice. And part of it was because they viewed patients with disabilities as demanding, and that providing treatment for patients with disabilities took more time that the doctors weren't more compensated anymore for. But part of it was also, there seemed to be some fairly explicit bias that came out of those focus groups, where doctors referred to patients with disabilities as an entitled group, right? So I think that your question about how do we actually kind of physically and from a policies and practices perspective create environments that are welcoming to everyone is an important one, but I still see that we're not going to do that until some of the ways of thinking about folks with disabilities changes, I'm afraid.
Hi, thanks for sharing your work. I just have one question. Through your project, that something was standing out to me was the relationship of capitalism to both raised people and people with disabilities, in that, for example, Black people and how their capabilities were always subject to a lot of extraction under capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
And on the flip side of that, people with disabilities have always been seen as not having value under capitalism. and so the double-edged sword of capitalism kind of subordinating both communities. I was kind of wondering whether your project develops on that a little bit.
So I allude to that some in the book, but I don't really explore it in terms of the capitalism as a driving force for that kind of double-edged view of Black people on one hand and people with disabilities on the other. I think that's, I would not disagree with that observation, but it's not something I really took on in the book. Thanks. We've reached our end time. Thank you. Thank you.